So let's talk about coding. We talked about coding in some of the earlier modules where we said that essentially you get a lot of verbatim text describing concomitant medications and adverse events in medical history, but in order to analyze that data, you have to be able to quantify it. So essentially that means you need to assign a numeric code to that verbatim text, and that code has to be assigned consistently, and in some cases you need to take a large number of codes and distill them down to a single code. So you need to have something that's quantifiable and consistent, and essentially that there is a numeric code that has been applied to your verbatim text. And I've got an example over here of a table that is showing the incidence of adverse events. So you can see that they are looking at the number of patients who reported diarrhea, the number that reported vomiting, the number that reported otitis media or ear infections, and these are actually numbers. But you have to remember that when this data was recorded in the case report form, it might have said severe diarrhea, it might have said runny stool. Sorry, I know these are awful examples, but this is the type of data you get. So all of those descriptions of diarrhea needed to be rolled up into one single term so that you could account for the total number of them in the trial. So essentially, coding is assigning a numeric code to the verbatim text so that you can quantify it and analyze it. So what do we code? Well, typically you're going to be coding medical history, adverse events, surgeries, procedures, and medications. And we actually have, and we'll talk about this in a second, some really common dictionaries that we use over and over again for these trials so that we have consistent expectations for how we code these texts, these verbatim texts. And here you can see one of these is an ICD-9 coding up in the upper right-hand corner, and you can actually see the number. The top one is, I think it's like L02 5.11, which is an abscess of the right hand. So you can see, in this case, you can see the verbatim text and then the code that it maps to. The lower table is a drug table, and you can see here that they have what they call an ATC code. We're not going to talk about ATC codes in depth, but basically I think it stands for anatomic, therapeutic, and chemical level coding. So it's a very sophisticated drill down type of code for drugs. And here you can see this is the code M01AX17, and then the drug that it stands for, numilicide, and you can kind of run down the list and see all the other codes that are assigned to these drugs. So hopefully when you look at this, you can get a sense of basically what I mean when I say you assign a numeric to a verbatim text. How do we code? Well, essentially, the site records or reports a verbatim term. So you might hear that phrase, a reported term or a verbatim term. This is essentially exactly what the site wrote down on the case report form or entered into the EDC system. And what we do when we code is we assign that numeric, which maps out to what they call the preferred term. This is the term that is preferred by the industry. So verbatim or reported is what the site's recorded, and preferred is what the industry wants to use when we do our analysis. All of these codes are in dictionaries, and it used to be that you actually pulled out a paper dictionary and you flipped through the book. I remember working in offices where we had volumes and volumes of these different dictionaries. But eventually they were all put into a data set, and we developed programs called autoencoders. And the autoencoder essentially, you port out a listing of all of the verbatim terms, and the autoencoder runs against them, and it matches all the ones that it can match. Then a person takes a look at the ones that don't match. That's called manual coding. They manually assign a code and plug that back into the autoencoder, and you just continue running listings throughout the life of the trial. When you get towards the end of the trial, you have somebody with a medical background who will come in and do a medical review to make sure that they'll look at both the verbatim term and the preferred term, and make sure that you consistently map the verbatims to the preferred terms and that you did it correctly. So this little slide shows you the verbatim term, abdominal distension, and the measure preferred term, which is also abdominal distension. But then there's some that you can see where there's a difference. Sorry, these all tend to be toilet issues. I know that's not so fun. I liked bowel urgency is the verbatim term, but defecation urgency is the preferred term, in case you ever need the preferred term for bowel urgency. I mentioned earlier that we have some common or standard dictionaries that we use in clinical trials. When I was first in the industry, there were several different dictionaries and multiple versions of these different dictionaries, and you could, one of the biggest things you had to do at the start of a trial was work with the sponsor to figure out which dictionary they wanted to use. And nowadays, that's really kind of narrowed down. We are, for the most part, people are using the World Health Organization dictionary to record adverse events in drugs, and then MEDRA as your overall medical dictionary. But it used to be that we had CoStart, and that's the old dictionary. It was replaced by MEDRA, but I'm going to have you go in and play around with it. It's kind of fun. People still use the ICD-9 or the new version ICD-10 to code concomitant medications. Then MEDRA is really the big boy. Everybody, most people are using MEDRA. MEDRA is the Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities. It is a joint international effort to have a single thesaurus for clinical trials, and it is maintained by an organization called the MSSO, or I think it's called the Maintenance Service Organization. So for the most part, you're going to hear, when you are dealing with coding dictionaries, you're going to hear people talking about MEDRA and the WHO dictionaries, which are the World Health Organization dictionaries. And again, these dictionaries, you can still get hard copies of them, but almost everybody is buying electronic versions of them, and they're very expensive. These are not cheap. They're buying electronic versions of them and feeding them into their auto-encoders and doing all the coding with these dictionaries. Commercial safety bases. Remember, the safety database is where you store the serious adverse event data. You don't store it in our EDC or clinical trials database. It's got its own database. They're called safety databases. Some of the commercial ones, or the ones you can go buy off the shelf, are ARIS Global, Argus, ClinTrace, AEIS, and Metadata has one called Safety Gateway. So I just want you to be aware of those. When you hear people talk about Argus, they're talking about the safety databases. We're going to talk really briefly about SAE to AE reconciliation. And I have this separate from the other non-CRF data because actually for two reasons. One is that you actually do get an adverse event CRF. But what you have to compare it to is the serious adverse event information, which does not come into the clinical database on a case report form. However, there are a number of commercial databases that are built just to handle serious adverse events. They're called safety management systems or safety databases, and I'm going to talk to you in a second about a few of the commercial ones out there. But what you need to fix in your mind is that there is a safety database and there is a clinical database. We in data management own and maintain the clinical database. The safety group manages the safety database. But at the end of a trial, and sometimes on an ongoing basis throughout a trial, we compare those two databases. And what we're trying to make certain of is all of the serious adverse events were pulled out of the AE database and captured in the safety database. Well, pulled out's the wrong term. That all the SAEs that were also adverse events need to have been reported to the regulatory authorities and the sponsors. And all of the serious adverse events should also have an associated adverse event in our clinical database, because typically we begin by seeing that something is an adverse event and recording it on the CRF, and then as we come to understand the severity of the reaction and the outcome of the reaction, that is the point at which it becomes identified as a serious event and a reportable event. So we do much more reconciliation work with the SAE to AE reconciliation than we did with the non-CRF data, and I have a nice PowerPoint that a group did I want you to look through on that SAE-AE reconciliation process. But essentially you're checking those demographics, not just the patient ID, but sex, gender, all that good stuff. You're looking to make sure the two terms match. You're particularly interested in the onset date, when the adverse events and SAE started. That needs to match. The outcome, what happened. Did the patient die? Did the SAE resolve? Were they hospitalized? The date it was resolved, whether you think it was caused by the drug, and the stop and start time of the study drug, so you can look at the potential chronological relationship. If there's a death, you need to know the date of death and the cause of death, and also any action taken regarding the study drug. In other words, did they take them off the study drug or reduce the study drug because of the serious adverse event? So SAE to AE reconciliation is between the safety database and the clinical database. The goal is to ensure that the SAE and AE are match up in the two, that for every SAE you also have an adverse event in the clinical database. You will not necessarily have a serious adverse event for every adverse event you have, because not all AEs are serious. Okay. You also want to reconcile your CRF database to any other data that you might have received for the study outside of that database. A very common reconciliation task is to compare the serious adverse events to the adverse events. And what you're looking for there is to make certain that for every adverse event that is indicated as being serious in your database, that it was actually reported appropriately and entered in the serious adverse event database, which is the safety database. Another very common type of reconciliation is when you get data imported in from a central laboratory. So in other words, you don't enter that data as a case report form screen, but you get a set of data sets on a regular basis from the central lab. You then have to compare your patient and visit records in your database with the laboratory samples, dates and visits and patient identifiers, and make certain that for every patient you have a corresponding lab for all visits, and for every lab you actually have a patient in your database. So you do that reconciliation both ways. So thank you for taking CLR 450 with me. I've had a wonderful time teaching this class. I hope it's been a good experience for you and that you have learned something about clinical data management. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions about the exam. Over the next few weeks, I'm going to be posting specifics about when you take it and how you take it. I figure we'll get through the Thanksgiving holidays first and turn around and take a look at that. Please make sure that you look over your midterm exam results and look at the feedback that I have in those. Look at all these slides, make sure you listen to the videos and do the additional readings. Also, feel free to contact me if you're starting to apply for jobs. You can get in touch with me and I will tell you whether or not I am willing to act as a reference for you. Very upfront about that. I am at INC Research. I'm the Director of Clinical Data Management for Raleigh there. You can reach me either at the LFS 9787 email address you've been using, or my work address, which is linda.shostak@incresearch.com. And best of luck.